the good news is that almost all countries and corporations want to keep the deal that they already made, knowing that the legal power that I, as president, have to make a new deal could be far worse for them, and therefore they will continue to work along the same successful path that we had negotiated before the Supreme Court's unfortunate involvement.
That's President Trump discussing his tariff agenda last night during the State of the Union. The president reworked 10% global tariffs, taking effect for up to 150 days under the Section 122 of the Trade Act. The administration preparing a separate order to raise the rate to 15% while consulting partners and conducting investigations. The European Union, for example, is seeking clarity on next steps, urging Washington to honor last year's trade agreement. Join me now, the man in charge of this, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, is here. Jamieson, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Give us your reaction to the president's speech last night. And you say that the U.S. is standing by existing trade deals right now, correct?
That's exactly right. The president's speech highlighted this. He talked about all the economic wins for average Americans, and he talked about how we're doing our trade policy with all of our partners. Just because we lost this case, it doesn't prevent us from essentially reconstructing the policy. And I've been in constant contact with our trading partners to help them understand how the replacement tools go along with the trade deals we've made with them.
So let's talk about that, because I know you were ready for a potential negative ruling. We've talked about this over the last several months, and you told our audience that you had access to other authorities. Now, you're talking about Section 122, and that has a 150-day bridge to Section 301 tariffs. Walk us through this.
That's right. So Section 122, it's about the balance of payments deficit, which we're experiencing in a number of different categories. And then we have a couple of tools, Section 301, Section 232. So Section 301 allows Office of the United States Trade Representative to investigate unfair trade practices on a country-by-country basis. And we've identified a lot of these. This includes things like people who use forced labor in their supply chains, countries where there's industrial excess capacity, where they build and build and build even though there's no demand, and they end up flooding our markets. And so these we consider to be unfair trading practices. And there's a host of other things: discrimination against our digital tech companies, subsidies for rice and seafood, and all kinds of things.
So tell us about these investigations and when you will be able to present where the areas are that you actually could perhaps raise tariffs because of those results of those investigations?
That's right. The way this works is we conduct public investigations. We'll put out a Federal Register notice. We have these prepared. They should be launched over the next few days and weeks. And it'll start a public comment process. There'll be hearings. We have consultations with our trading partners. And so companies and people affected by these unfair trading practices can actually come in, provide a written comment, speak at a hearing that we hold at our office, and then we'll do a report. And we'll report our findings on all of this. We'll calculate the amount of harm to the American people caused by these unfair trade practices. And if these things aren't resolved by our partner countries, then we can impose a tariff. The president can impose a tariff. He can impose a fee on services. He has a lot of leeway on what he can do. When the president talks about the case actually resulting in him having a stronger program, this is what he's talking about. It's a very detailed public process that allows him to put into place very durable tariffs under existing law.
But you just did a deal, for example, with Indonesia. You told us that was coming. I mean, should we expect that some of the deals that were already in place could be modified then?
Well, we'll see. We think that the deals that we've made with these folks actually tend to address, at least in part, some of the practices I'm talking about. So with Indonesia, for example, we'll run an investigation. We'll look at industrial excess capacity. We'll look at what they're doing in fishing and that kind of thing. And we'll run that investigation. And then we'll bump it up against what they've agreed to do and what we think the problem is. And then we'll make a determination on what kind of tariff should apply. We expect to have continuity in what we're doing. Even right now, we have the 10% tariff. It'll go up to 15 for some, and then it may go higher for others. And I think it will be in line with the types of tariffs we've been seeing. We want to have continuity in this program.
Well, some countries are worried that, the tariffs that you're talking about that may materialize are actually higher than what they're paying right now. Look at the situation with the UK.
That could, I guess there's a world where that could happen, but I think that would really only happen if the countries reneged on their deals or doubled down on these unfair trade practices. A big point of all the deals we've made over the past year, and these are real agreements, they're substantive, and countries have made specific commitments to change some of these unfair trading practices, but we have to make sure they do it. We have to make sure that we have an enforcement mechanism, and the Section 301 investigations of potential tariffs, that is the enforcement mechanism to make sure that countries comply with their deals.
One analyst was saying that Section 338 could be used, that you could actually go all the way up to 50% in terms of tariffs there based on that legal authority. Is that on the table?
So that legal authority is about 100 years old. It's still good law. We've looked at that. We think that could be helpful in specific circumstances. That law focuses on when countries discriminate against the U.S. relative to other countries. And a lot of countries have the same tariffs toward other countries. They have the same policy across countries. So you have to look at a really specific instance where the U.S. is discriminated against relative to a third country. And I think there are probably going to be instances where that matter. But I think the Section 301 investigations and then the Section 232 investigations that the Commerce Department has, these are areas where we can have very durable investigations, very durable tariffs where necessary, and they've stood up to legal scrutiny in the past, and they will again.
Now, if you're talking about excess capacity, to me, one country comes to mind, and that is China, trying to get their products through, even not just directly, but through other ports in other countries. The president's obviously going to China in April, at the end of March for his 3-day visit. These high-stakes talks with Xi Jinping. Have you been discussing that excess capacity with China, and are they going to change their behavior?
Well, we have discussed this with China. It's a regular point that we make to our counterparts when we speak with them, Secretary Besson and I. And they don't have the same market economics that we have to deal with. Our companies have to make money, and if they don't, they have to shut down. In China, and even in Vietnam and some other countries, if the companies can't make money or they have to sell below cost to keep their factories open, they'll get an infusion of cash from the local government, from the provincial government. They'll get subsidies because they're not trying to make money. They're just trying to keep the factories up. They're trying to corner the market. And so we've talked to the Chinese about this. They have their model. I don't think they're going to resolve that problem fully, and that's part of why we need to have tariffs on China and Vietnam and other countries that have this problem.
Are you willing to put an aggressive tariff on China right now?
Well, I think that over the past year, we've come to an agreement with China. They understand we're going to have some level of tariffs. You'll recall last April, we both escalated to about 145% tariffs. We de-escalated all of that. Since that time, we've had anywhere between 35, 40 to 50% tariffs on China, depending on the product. We expect that level to remain in place. We don't intend to escalate beyond that. We intend to really stick to the deal that we had before.
Well, one thing that China does, I know, is they'll deem certain industries off limits to foreign investment, or like national security related industries. The president suggested that perhaps, and there were reports that the president would look to tariff certain industries that are important, critical to national security. Is that are you pursuing that?
Well, the president has already done that with a lot of important sectors: automotive, steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, et cetera. So a lot of those programs are already on their way or in effect, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. So the Commerce Department has done a great job of already putting a lot of that into place. And now we'll be doing some Section 301s as well to have country-specific tariffs.
And in terms of national security, you would think that would include pharmaceuticals as well as semiconductor chips.
Exactly right. And that's why we have open investigations, national security tariffs on those items. And so I know the Commerce Department's working very hard on those.
And what do you want to say about the exemptions to the 15% tariff? They're not stacking things like USMCA compliant goods. What can you tell us about your conversations right now with Canada and Mexico in bilateral deals?
Well, again, we're trying to have continuity with the program that we've had over the past year. When we talk to businesses, and even when we talk to foreign countries, what they want to know is what is the plan. And so the plan that we've established over the past year, where we've had booming GDP, wage increases at the same time as tariffs, we're just continuing that as closely as we can to avoid disruption. The Canadians, I was in contact with my counterpart just this morning. He's going to come to town in a couple weeks. They have a few ideas on how they might want to have a deal with us. We're obviously open to that. We really want to focus on reshoring here. We want to have production here. We don't necessarily want to be dependent on China, Canada, or anybody else for things like cars and that kind of thing. But we're open to talk, and we'll see what they have to say.
When would you expect to deal with Canada?
Well, we'll see. We have this year the review of USMCA, and on July 1st, we'll have to indicate to Congress whether we intend to just stay in without changes or whether we need to have further work on it. So we're going to be focused on that. My office is focused on implementing our agreements, reconstructing the tariffs, and of course doing the review of USMCA this year.
And any information on the potential for refunding that money, that the companies and importers are saying they want a refund given the Supreme Court decision?
Well, there are a lot of companies that have put in their claims, and remember, we had a bunch of Democratic attorneys general sue the government so that these companies could get money back, right? We're trying to protect American jobs, American workers, and the Democratic AGs are suing so that companies, many of them the U.S. subsidiaries of foreign companies, can get their money back. So those claims are proceeding. The courts will deal with that. They'll tell us the time, place, and manner of any type of refund.
Jamieson, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on.
We so appreciate you being here. Jamieson Greer, stay with us. We'll be right back. You're watching Mornings with Maria, live from Washington.